folks. We are getting ready for the next part of our program tonight. And I want to offer a huge welcome to Doug Tallamy, who is our keynote speaker for the Brenda Butner Memorial Lecture tonight. I first heard Doug at the CNPS Conservation Conference a few years ago, and it was a transformative experience for me. I can't put it any other way. I was already very much involved with native plants at the time, but he just was so inspirational. And for me personally, it's actually been really great these past several months, because when I get too down about the climate and what's going on, I go out and plant some more native plants and fiddle around with them and feel like I'm doing something for the environment. And I have Doug to thank for that. Doug is a professor at the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware. He's authored 103 research publications and has taught insect-related courses for 40 years. One of his main research goals is to better understand the many ways insects interact with plants and how these interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. His book, Bringing Nature Home: How Native Plants Sustain Wildlife in Our Gardens, was published by Tinker Press in 2007, and it was awarded the 2008 Silver Medal by the Garden Writers Association. He's written 2 other books, The Living Landscape, which he co-authored with Richard Darke, and then just this year, a new book, Nature's Best Hope, which was released by Tinker Press in February. And now I'm going to turn it over to Doug. We're so excited to have you here and to hear your talk. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Vivian. It is a pleasure to be here tonight, and thanks for listening, everybody. I want to tell you what my idea of nature's best hope is, but before I do that, I want to return to what happened on the East Coast last fall. Not this fall, but last fall, we had what we call an oak mast. All the oaks in the red oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time, and this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and just stared at it. And I was rewarded. An insect started to chew its way out of the acorn, and it chewed, made a little hole, and then squeezed itself through. Looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy for a while there. Finally plopped down. Very dangerous time for this insect larva, because it's a tasty morsel. Lots of things want to eat it. So it's got to get to safety below ground, and it does that with a little bit more squirming. Down it goes in about 30 seconds, where it stretches in all directions and makes a chamber. And within that chamber, it converts itself to a pupa and stays there for 2 years. After 2 years, it comes out as an acorn weevil. There are acorn weevils all over the country. You have many of them in California. This is what a weevil looks like. Everybody thinks it has a very long nose, but in fact, that is an extension of the head capsule, and at the base of that extension, way down here, where the mouth parts are, females take those mouth parts and chew a hole down into the center of the acorn, turn around and lay an egg in that hole, and that's how the larva gets down there. Now, you might wonder why they spend 2 years underground. And the answer is that many acorns, particularly the red oak groups, take 18 months to develop. So if they came out the very next year, they wouldn't have enough acorns to use again. Well, that leaves a hole, a true vacuum. You know, nature abhors a vacuum. Well, she has filled it this time with 3 species of ants in the genus Temnothorax, where they love to live in the vacated holes made by acorn weevils in acorns. And if they discover a newly vacated hole, they get very excited. They tell everybody in the colony, time to move in, because their old acorn is falling apart. So they get busy. In about 30 minutes, they carry the entire colony in there. Then they post a guard. Can't find my pointer right there. Make sure that nobody else comes in, no uninvited guests, and they will live here for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. Well, about this time, my wife says, "What's your point? What are you trying to tell us?" I'm trying to tell you that nature is built from thousands, millions of such types of specialized interactions. It's really a series of interactions that are highly specialized. For example, you won't have breeding pileated woodpeckers unless you have lots of carpenter ants, because that is what they rear their young on. And you're not going to have carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You're not going to have the beloved Emarginia, a beautiful moth. That's a moth right there. Looks just like lichens. It is a specialist on mistletoe, which in turn is a specialist on your California oaks. So all these things weave themselves together. You won't have 60 species of native California bees unless you have the pollen of your native sunflowers, particularly the perennial sunflowers. So if you have the pollen, great, you've got the option for 60 species of bees in your yard, but if you don't, you've lost that opportunity. So nature is a series of specialized relationships, but today, these relationships and nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we did not take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, leave it as it is. And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Well, the problem, of course, today is that we can't leave most of the country as it was because we have changed it. Often we changed it, hundreds of years ago. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states that's anything close to its original pristine condition. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly. We have tilled it. We have drained it. We've grazed it. We have 770 million acres of rangeland in the US, which is 4.5 times the size of Texas. And of course, we've paved it or otherwise developed it. We've straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers, and we've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up the natural world into tiny remnants of its former self. And each one of those remnants are too small and too isolated from each other to preserve the species that run the ecosystems that we all depend on. You might wonder why we've done all these things. Not sure, except I would guess that the answer is we thought the earth, our nest, was so large that we could foul it forever and there'd be no consequences. But of course, we were wrong about that. And that's why we're seeing headlines like this at a pretty regular clip. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America has lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. That's 1/3 of our North American bird population gone. And the UN now predicts that we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, possibly within the next 20 years. And I love the way they offer these headlines as if it doesn't matter. I mean, they might as well say, we're going to lose oxygen in the next 20 years and then go on to the next headline. This is not an option, folks. This is simply not an option. We have to make sure that doesn't happen. Well, I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, thus upon all of our houses, but it's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It is a cure that will take small efforts from lots of people, but those efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return to this headline briefly. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, the great Edward O. Wilson, E.O. Wilson from Harvard, told us what it would mean if we were to lose insects on planet Earth. And he did it way back in 1987 in this paper called The Little Things That Run the World. His message was very, very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, not only would it change the physical structure of terrestrial ecosystems, it would essentially end energy flow through those ecosystems. In other words, it would cause the collapse, the rapid collapse of the food webs that support our animals, our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds, our mammals, and even our freshwater fish would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that right now rapidly turn over nutrients. And all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. There is good news though, and that is that doesn't have to happen. We can save our insects. We can save our birds. We can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why? Well, because humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on nature. We're dependent on what we call ecosystem services, the things that nature produces to keep us alive. Here are some of the things that plants do for us. And when I say us, they do it for all the living things. They produce oxygen, pretty important. Clean water, also important, and slow the journey of rain. It's always heading towards the sea, but once it hits the ocean, it's too salty to use. Plants slow that journey down. They capture carbon, enormously important ecosystem service today. They're pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, fixing the carbon in their tissues, but then there's a lot of excess carbon and they pump it into the ground. Our soils are brown or black because of the carbon that plant roots have deposited there. Plants build topsoil, hold it in place, they prevent floods, they dampen severe weather, and lots of other really critical things. What do animals do for plants? Well, they provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds. And again, many other things. So designing landscapes, it might be beautiful, but landscapes that actually destroy ecosystem services is not an option. It never was a good option. But today with 7.8, 7.9 billion people on the planet, it's not an option at all. We need more ecosystem services today than ever before. There were visionaries through the ages who recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth. And one of the most eloquent was Aldo Leopold, early part of the 1900s. He wrote extensively, and one of the things he said when he was writing was, the oldest task in human history is to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. Now we've had indigenous groups that have been good at doing that, but our huge Western and Asian extractive societies have been terrible at that. We almost always take more than the earth has to offer, and we move to another place and spoil that in another place. Aldo recognized that was not sustainable at all, so he had a dream that we humans would actually develop what he called a land ethic. In his dream, we would be able to use the land, and we have to do that. We would farm it and lumber it and graze and mine and do all of those things, but we'd learn to do it gently. We would learn to use the earth without destroying local ecosystems. And that's what he called the land ethic. He wrote about in his very famous book, the Sand County Almanac. What he never talked about was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why, but I suspect that the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time, that notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, it's still embedded in our own culture, that he didn't even recognize it as an option. Well, tonight I'm going to push the idea that living with nature not only is an option, I'm going to argue that it is the only viable option that is left to us. What we have to do is find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. Living, we have humans here, nature someplace else. That model just isn't going to work anymore because there is no someplace else for nature. Where should we start? Well, one thing we have to consider when we're talking about the future of conservation is private property. And that's because so much of the country is privately owned. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. Huge amounts of California is privately owned. I think the figure for the entire country is something like 78% privately owned. If we ignored private property, we would fail because we wouldn't be doing conservation in enough places to sustain the amounts of nature that we need to do. But there are lots of areas that we don't ever consider for possible conservation centers that we should start considering. How about power and pipeline rights of ways, or railroad rights of ways, or roadsides? 21 million acres, 3 million acres, 17 million acres in those types of rights of ways. Golf courses, 2 million acres. Airports, 3 million acres. The Denver airport is twice the size of Manhattan. I mean, these are huge areas. Then we have all the places where we live, both in rural areas, suburbia, our ex-urban and urban areas, hundreds of millions of acres in those places. And you could think of other places, but just these, if you add it up, that's 599 million acres that we could be using for conservation that right now we really don't. How big is 599 million acres? Well, it's bigger than Vermont, plus New Jersey, plus Maine, plus Virginia, New York, Georgia, Florida, Oklahoma, Montana, Texas, and California. You add them all up, that's 599 million acres. So not having a place to do conservation is not the issue. We have plenty of places we can do conservation. Now, when I talk about conservation, I'm really not using the word correctly. I'm not talking about going out and conserving pristine areas. We certainly need to do that, but there aren't enough pristine areas left. I'm talking about restoring nature, putting it back together where we have torn it asunder. But in order to do that, we can't just add species willy-nilly to our restoration. We have to start with the most important species. Not all species contribute equally to ecosystem functions, so we have to start with the building blocks, the species that other species depend on. And one of the first things you have to do is rebuild a food web, which means you have to have the plants that are going to capture energy from the sun, turn it into food, and then, of course, that's the food that supports all the animals that are out there. But most animals don't eat plants directly. They eat something that ate plants. And that something is typically insects. And it turns out that caterpillars are the insects that transfer more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater, more than elephants, more than anything. So if we took caterpillars out of the system, most of the energy would remain locked up in plants, and you would not have viable food webs. Let me use the Carolina chickadee as an example. Any of the chickadee species are doing the same thing, but this is what we have here at our house in southeastern Pennsylvania. They're seed eaters during the winter, or at least 50% of their diet is seeds. The other 50% is insects. But when they're reproducing, their babies can't eat seeds. So they switch totally to insects. And if they are in a healthy environment, they feed their young exclusively on caterpillars. And it turns out they're not alone. 96% of our terrestrial birds are rearing their young on insects, and most of those insects turn out to be caterpillars. How do we know that? There's lots of lines of evidence that suggest that, but here's a study that my PhD student, Ashley Kennedy, recently finished. What she did was put out a call to bird photographers around the country to send in pictures of birds while they were feeding young, while they were carrying food to the nest. And she got thousands of pictures and was able to identify the prey item in the beaks of the birds, and then reconstruct the nestling diet for 20 of the common bird families in North America. The green bars are the percentage of the diet that was caterpillars, and in 16 of the 20 bird families, caterpillars dominated the diet. So again, imagine what would happen if we took caterpillars out of the system. 16 of the 20 common bird families in North America would not be able to reproduce. So there is something special about caterpillars. What is it? Actually, several things special about caterpillars. And the first one is that they're soft. They're soft as a prey item. Think of this guy as a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is exoskeleton, it's cuticle, it's undigestible. So birds don't want a lot of that. They want all the goodies that are inside that. And because it's soft, you can stuff it down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring it. And if you've ever watched a parent bird feed their young, they're pretty rough. Their beak's like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, some of our birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They are nutritious. They're very high in fats, very high in protein. Again, they have a very low percentage of chitin compared to other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. Much of a beetle is undigestible, and they tend to have a lot of sharp edges. Excuse me. And finally, caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mentioned carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate, and you're a vertebrate, and birds are vertebrates, and vertebrates cannot make their own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids, yet carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. So we all have to get our carotenoids from plants. And that's why my wife Cindy says I have to eat my beta carotene. I got to eat my carrots to get my beta carotene. I have to eat my tomatoes to get my lycopene, my whatever that is to get my lutein. And she makes sure I do eat those things so that they stimulate my immune system. And I can't think of a better time to have a very strong immune system. Carotenoids are also antioxidants. They run around our body and protect our DNA from oxidative damage. They improve color vision. When your mother said, eat your carrots, you will see better, she was right. She didn't know she was right, but it turns out she was right. They improve sperm vitality, improve sexual attractiveness. Now we're talking about things like this male prothonotary warbler. He is bright yellow because he's had access to lots of luteins. And he makes pigments out of those luteins, puts them in his feathers. And the brighter yellow he is, the more ladies he attracts. Well, where are the birds getting their carotenoids from? What they eat, of course. But when they're feeding their young, this is what they're eating. They're eating a whole bunch of insects and other invertebrates. But the carotenoid content is not equal across those groups. The first two bars here are types of caterpillars. Far more carotenoids in caterpillars than any other type of bird food. Followed by orthopteroids. the crickets and grasshoppers and katydids. Here are the adult caterpillars way down here, the moths and the butterflies themselves. They have far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating green leaves. And this is the earthworm way over here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. For most birds, then, it's really looking like caterpillars are essential components of the diet. They are not optional. So let's just say birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many caterpillars do they need? Well, that's a good question. Is one or two enough? Well, let's go back to chickadees because we've got a lot of diet on chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a clutch of chickadees? One or two is not enough. It takes thousands, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get the clutch of chickadees just to the point where they fledge, depending on the number of chicks in the nest. And after they fledge, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars for another 24 days until the birds completely reach independence. But they're flying all around, so nobody's been able to count those caterpillars. But you're talking about many, many thousands of caterpillars to make one clutch of a bird that's 1/3 of an ounce. And if you want these chickadees breeding in your yard, you've got to make that many caterpillars in your yard. Because chickadees forage about 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot, and that is true for most of our birds. And if we don't make that many caterpillars in our yard, that's called insect decline. And it's starting to seriously look like insect decline is one of the major causes of bird declines that we're talking about here. If you go to the original data of Rosenberg et al. That says that we've lost 3 billion birds in North America, and divide those birds up into the species that require insects at some point of their life history, this group here, versus the species that don't require insects, the finches and the doves that can reproduce on seeds, and some other birds. They actually come back here. They actually gained some numbers in the last 50 years, but the bird species that require insects lost on average 10 million individuals per species. So this doesn't prove cause and effect between insect decline and bird decline, but it certainly is suggestive that those two are linked. So I'm going to conclude from that, before we lose all our birds, that we need to start landscaping for caterpillars. So how do we do that? Well, you add caterpillars to your landscapes by adding the plants that make them. Now, admittedly, this is a very different goal for landscaping. In the past, we've landscaped in ways that would prevent any insects from being in our spaces. We thought our plants were just decorations. We didn't want any of them touched. But then, of course, we had dead landscapes. So now we want to put plants that support caterpillars. Seems easy, but there is a catch. And the catch is that not all plants make caterpillars. As a matter of fact, most plants don't make a lot of caterpillars. And that's because most caterpillars are really fussy about what they eat. Nothing illustrates it better than the monarch butterfly. You can have all your ornamental plants from Asia in your yard, or the ornamental plants from the East in your yard. And you won't be able to sport any monarchs unless you have milkweeds, because that is what they have specialized on. And it turns out most of the insects that eat plants are what we call host plant specialists. They're just as fussy as monarchs. Why? Because plants have made them that way. Plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their tissues with nasty tasting compounds, secondary metabolic compounds that make those tissues either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And if you don't believe me, go outside and find a leaf and eat it. See if you like it. You're not going to like it. Every single plant lineage protects itself chemically with nasty chemicals. And that's why it's green out there. It's not because there are no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. There is a reason it is hard to get our kids to eat their vegetables. They inherently know that they're toxic. Yes, that's my little joke, but this is not a joke. Insects really do eat plants. How do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. They can only eat the plant lineage for which they have developed specialized adaptations to circumvent the plant defenses that are in that particular plant lineage. Every single plant lineage protects itself in one particular way, and insects cannot adapt to all of them. So they focus on one particular plant lineage, or maybe two that share common cocktails of chemical defenses, and they develop the enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, the behavioral adaptations, the life history adaptations that minimize their exposure to those nasty compounds. But it takes a long period of evolutionary history with those compounds for all those adaptations to fall into place. It does not happen overnight. And that's why so few things can eat the eucalyptus that you have there in California, because it hasn't been there long enough. It's a plant from Australia. The insects in Australia can eat eucalyptus, but not in North America. They haven't created the adaptations yet. So all I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. If we're trying to rebuild functional food webs in areas where we have dismantled them in the past, we've got to choose the plants that are going to support the insects, that transfer the energy from those plants to other animals. If we don't, it's not going to work. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well it does work, starting with our house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. That's the southeast corner of Pennsylvania, about an hour south of Philadelphia. I am sitting in that window right up there now. There was a very old farm, been farmed from the late 1600s, so 300 years, that was broken up into 10-acre lots. The soil was absolutely exhausted, very little topsoil left. And what was growing here, which they were mowing for hay when they actually sold the farm, was all the invasive species that had escaped from our gardens: multiflora rose and oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle, and all the things that we have on the East Coast that are plaguing our natural areas. They would mow that stuff and call it hay. So when they stopped mowing, when we started building the house, this is what grew back. It's just a tangle of Asian vines. That's a lot of oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle and bush honeysuckle and all that stuff. And the entire 10 acres was covered. That is my wife, Cindy, getting ready to remove all of this stuff. So if you have a serious invasive species problem, don't despair. You really can. If you can't eliminate it, you can certainly get it under control. It is a lot of work, there's no doubt, but if skinny old Cindy can do it, you can do it. So what was I doing when she was removing all these things? I was telling her she was doing a great job, but I was putting plants back. And I did it selfishly. I've got a little hobby of taking pictures of caterpillars, so I always want to attract caterpillars to our yard that we don't have. And I started with the Canadian owlet. That's a Canadian owlet. That's what the adult looks like. But Canadian owlets are specialists on meadow rue. There's no meadow rue here anymore. I mean, there used to be hundreds of years ago, but long, long gone. No meadow rue anywhere around us. So I had to get some seeds from someplace else, but I planted meadow rue, grew really nicely. But I didn't know how long. I mean, this was an experiment. I didn't know whether the Canadian owlet would be able to find my meadow rue ever, or if it did, how long it would take. So I didn't go out and check my meadow rue. It was a month and a half after it was up before I just walked by it accidentally, and I looked, and it was almost defoliated with Canadian owlets. They had found it right away. I have no idea where they came from because there's no meadow rue around us, but that worked really well. Now we got a good population of meadow rue and Canadian owlets. So there you go. I've added 2 species to our property. Another example, this is the goldenrod stowaway. It's a misnomer because this beautiful moth has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on this plant, Bidens aristosa. I did know where there was some Bidens aristosa in a power line cut about 14 miles away. So I went and got some seeds, planted them. Excuse me, I'm having problems with my dinner here. It took about a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my Bidens, but it did. And now we've got a great population of both of those. So there we go. We've added 4 species to the property. I wanted hackberry emperor. It's a butterfly that ought to be here, but as its name suggests, that's what it looks like. It is a specialist on hackberry, and we didn't have any hackberry. So I planted hackberry, another tree that should be here. It took 3-4 years before those butterflies found our hackberry, but now we have a good population of both again. I went out and checked one of my hackberry, or just walked by one of my hackberry branches this June, and there were 9 hackberry emperor butterfly caterpillars on that single branch. So another big success. So that's 6 species we've added to the property. I did not plant goldenrod. It came in on its own, and along with it came many of the things that eat goldenrod. In my neck of the woods, that's 110 species of caterpillars. So things like the brown-hooded owlet, the Arcigera flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparagonothus, goldenrod gall moth, they all came. Here's one that hasn't come yet, the goldenrod flower moth, and it's beautiful larvae. I don't know why they haven't found our goldenrod, but they haven't. So this is part of the game. This is anticipation. It's like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. Every year I check for the goldenrod flower moth. One of these years I'm going to find it, and that'll be a great day. Planted Virginia creeper. It's a beautiful vine here in the east, nice fall color. And it plays nice. You know, it can crawl up our trees without pulling them down, without girdling them, and it supports a lot of beautiful sphinx moths, things like the Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the Leonard sphinx, the hog sphinx, the Abbott sphinx, all found on Virginia creeper. And of course, many other things are as well. I wanted the zebra swallowtail. This is the prettiest swallowtail here in the east. But this was a real test because we were at the very northern limit of its distribution. It is a specialist on pawpaw. Of course, we didn't have any pawpaw, so I planted pawpaw, but the nearest population I knew of was 26 miles south of us. And I really wondered whether they'd be able to get up and use our pawpaw. We waited 9 years, but they finally did. They found it. And now we got a population of both the pawpaw and zebra swallowtail. And we have lots of pawpaws too. I wanted the double-toothed prominent to come to our house because it's a caterpillar that looks like a dinosaur. I mean, who wouldn't want that? It's an elm specialist, so we planted American elm. So now we've got both of those. Wanted the evening primrose moth. It's a specialist on evening primrose, so we added evening primrose to the yard. This is what the moth does during the day. You also have a specialist on evening on your primrose species, the Pacific green sphinx moth, beautiful moth that you can have if you have that primrose. And we planted lots of oaks. Now, these are just examples of the plants that we have added to our house. But I want to focus on oaks for a while because across the country, not only here, but in California as well, oaks are the #1 species in terms of supporting caterpillars. I'll talk more about that in a minute, but this is the Bedford Oak in Bedford, New York. And people argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. But it illustrates what a lot of people think. They think you have to have enormous oaks before they can start contributing to your property. I hear people all the time saying, I don't want to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. Well, unless you die before next year, you will live long enough to enjoy it. And I can say that with confidence because I planted my oaks as acorns or as 2-foot bare root whips. But I learned that right away, the things that use oaks come to those very small plants and start to rebuild the food web. And then you get to enjoy everything associated with that. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, juvenile's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, the orange-headed epicalema, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the orange-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the spun glass moth, the delightful dagger moth, the pleasant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bucolatrix, the white blotch heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths have come to the oaks that we've added to our property. And they come right away. This is a pin oak that has just popped up above the leaf litter, and here's a crocus geometer standing on the ground eating the leaves of that tree. So you don't have to wait centuries for your oak to start to contribute. It contributes right away. Now this is a picture of my house. I'm still sitting in this window right here, taken not too long ago, to illustrate that we're traditionally, we've got our lawn here, but we put plants back. I'm still adding plants. Who knows what the original plant diversity was, but we're adding plants all the time. And I recognize that every time I add a new plant lineage to the house, I find new caterpillar species, new moth species. So I made it a goal about 4 years ago to start taking pictures of all the moth species that have come to our property here in Pennsylvania. And I am up to 1,027 species of moths. Now we have 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So on 1/240,000th of the land area, we have 40% of all the moth species that occur in Pennsylvania. And each one of those species is a type of bird food And that probably explains why we have recorded 59 species of terrestrial birds that have bred on our 10 acres. And that is 38% of all the terrestrial birds that breed in Pennsylvania. The point is that this works. You put the plants back and it works. And by the way, was it 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, we saw the headline that the World Wildlife Fund says we've lost 2/3 of the wildlife on planet Earth in the last 50 years. All I can say is not at our house. I'm willing to bet that we have increased biodiversity by 2/3 at our house. And so that's the encouraging message. This is reversible. All those terrible headlines are reversible if we act now. I know what you're thinking now. You may not own 10 acres, and a lot of people live in suburbia. Will it work on much smaller properties? That is a good question. So let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri, and ask that question. They live on 0.6 acres, about 18 times smaller area than what Cindy and I have. And they're in a typical suburban neighborhood where they're surrounded by people with big lawns and all those Asian plants. Well, the serious invasive plant in Kirkwood, Missouri is bush honeysuckle. So the first thing they did was get rid of their bush honeysuckle. I was visiting the Terpstras just before the virus broke out, by the way. And they planted lots of native plants to replace the bush honeysuckle, but they also put in a little water feature called a bubbler. And then they sat back and started to count the birds that use their property. They're up to 149 bird species, including 35 warbler species. That's almost all the warbler species in North America. And just to compare, on our 10 acres, we've only recorded 8 species of warblers at our house. So yes, it works on much smaller properties. And this, of course, is Kathy Kramer's yard. You can do this in California as well. I don't know if Kathy's counting the insects or the birds that use her property, but I guarantee that a property like this is going to support a lot of things. Can it work in urban yards, though? Well, let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago. She has 1/10 of an acre, which is 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. There's no connectivity with her little property in any other natural area. So she's just a tiny island. She lives right next to one of O'Hare Airport's runways and right next to Kennedy Expressway. So she's really in an urban area. On her little property, she got rid of her invasive plants, put in 60 species of native plants, put in a little water feature for the birds, and then she started to count her birds, and she's up to 116 species of birds that have used her yard, including a woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, you can go to Pam's house and check it out. But what about city centers? 82% of us live in cities now. Well, in 2014, I was looking at this plant. This is butterfly weed, Asclepias tuberosa. At least that's what people call it, butterfly weed. But it reminds me that we have a marketing issue with our native plants. We call them weeds and wonder why people don't plant them. So let's not call this butterfly weed. Let's call it Monarch's Delight. All right, 2014, I'm staring at Monarch's Delight, and the first thing I see are 2 species of leafcutter bees, megachilid bees. I know they're leafcutter bees because they carry their pollen on their tummy, not on their legs. Leafcutter bees have very specific requirements. I hadn't seen these species in a long time, and I was very surprised to be seeing them here because not only do they require pollen and nectar, they require soft leaves like you would find on red buds, because they carve out the edges of those leaves, roll them up into a tube and stuff them full of pollen, and that's where they lay their eggs and reproduce. Then they put that whole package into a crack or a crevice. Well, there was a red bud growing right next to Monarch's Delight, so the leafcutter bees had everything that they needed. And because there was a red bud there, red bud blooms very early in the spring. It's one of the first things to bloom. It produces lots of forage for queen bumblebees. And of course, bumblebees overwinter as queens. There are no workers to help her out in the springtime. She's got to do all the work until she raises her first set of offspring. So she needs very efficient forage opportunities, or the colony fails. Well, because the redbud was there, she had what she needed, and there were bumblebees there as well. And then I saw a monarch. Actually saw 2 monarchs here foraging on Monarch Delight. Now this was 2014. In the east, the 2013 was the low point of the eastern monarch population. Only 3.6% of the monarchs left compared to 1976. I had gone all of 2013 without seeing a single monarch. And here it was, this was June. So that's very early in the season for us to be seeing monarchs this far north on the East Coast. It usually takes them much longer to get there. So I was really encouraged. It seemed like, well, maybe the monarchs are going to come back. Why were they there? Well, they had Monarch's Delight. There was also another species of milkweed. So they had the nectar they needed, but they also had the host plant. Now they could start to reproduce. Do you know where I was? I was on the Highline in the middle of Manhattan. And this is the Highline. It is a renovated, elevated railroad that is now a tourist destination. Maybe some of you have been here. We're 30 feet above the taxis here, right in the middle of the heart of Manhattan. Millions of species go to the Highline to get a little bit of nature in the middle of Manhattan. It is hardly the place where I would expect to see monarchs or leafcutter bees. Somebody's doing a survey of the bees on the Highline. They're up to 30 species. This is Rick Darke. He convinced me finally. I mean, he was after me to go see the Highline and see all the wonderful plantings for years, but I resisted. I'm not much of a city boy. And if I see pretty plants, I want to see things using them. And I didn't think anything would be in the middle of Manhattan, but I was totally wrong. And I'm glad I was wrong. It proved to me that even though the Highline is not 100% native plants, there are enough thoughtful native plantings there that life has come to Manhattan. And if we can bring life to Manhattan with just a few native plants, we can do it anywhere. But there are 4 keys to success that we need to think about countrywide, and one of them is shrinking the area that's in lawn. Now you people in California aren't the prime movers in terms of lawn. You recognize you don't have the water for it. But across the rest of the country, we have 40 million acres of lawn, which is dedicated to a status symbol, which is a dead space. It's the size of New England that is lawn, and we're still adding 500 square miles of lawn to the US every year. Totally unsustainable. I'm suggesting that we cut that area in half. The area of lawn we keep is still going to be manicured. We're still going to be good citizens. We won't be thrown out of our neighborhoods. But we're going to put plants back in the rest of the area. And if we do that in half the area that's now in lawn, that will give us 20 million acres to work with. And if we put those native plants that are supporting food webs back in that 20 million acres at home, we can create a new national park that we call Homegrown National Park. And it will be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So we will have the largest national park in the country. And there are distinct benefits from bringing nature home to where you live. And this is a big one here. You can develop a personal relationship with some aspect of the natural world at your own pace, at your own time. You can do it for the first time, or if you had a good relationship when you were a child, you can re-establish that relationship simply by walking out your door. You can avoid crowds. You know, if you go to a national park today, you're there with millions of other people. It's hard to have that personal experience with nature. It's also free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed. No matter how many viruses or pandemics come down the road, you can always go out in your yard. No travel hassles. And you can experience the natural world alone. That's the key there. There's no way you're going to develop that personal relationship with the natural world if you're not alone. This is particularly important for our kids who are now suffering from nature deficit disorder because they have no relationship with nature. Why do we want them to have a relationship with nature? Well, not only is there are tremendous health benefits associated with it, but they're going to be the future stewards of the planet. We can't live without nature, and if we have nobody stewarding it, if they don't even know what it is, they're going to be lousy stewards. So we're working hard to expose them to nature. And what do? We get 30 kids, put them on a bus with a teacher. They drive for an hour and then walk around some natural area. Teacher tells them not to touch anything, and they get back on the bus and drive home. And that's their experience with the natural world. I'm sure that's better than nothing, but it's really an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If you have some part of nature at home, you walk out the door, get your kids to experience it alone. No parental supervision. They've got to do trial and error and figure out what works, what doesn't work. Maybe they can learn to hunt lizards. And I'm learning this from my own granddaughter. This is Zoe, who lives in Hawaii. And her piece of nature is pretty small. It's a patch of grass about 10 by 10 feet with a hedge. But there are anole lizards there. And this is how you hunt them, Zoe tells me. You get on the ground and you crawl very slowly after you have disguised yourself with leaves and sticks. You crawl slowly towards the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business here. You can wear your best dress, that's okay. But the object is to catch the lizard, put it in an aquarium, and then you can study it, as she says. That's a personal relationship that she has developed. This is her little game. She does it quite frequently. I don't think she's going to be crawling on the ground with leaves and sticks on her dress for the rest of her life, but I guarantee she will remember hunting lizards in Hawaii the rest of her life. If you want to expose your kids to more than hunting lizards, get this book by Nancy Stranisti, Nature Play at Home. Hundreds of examples of how to expose kids in very small areas to the natural world. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. What plants are we going to put in the area we take out of lawn? Well, at least some of them have to be what I call keystone plants. Keystone plants. It turns out that not all native plants are equal in their ability to contribute to future, to the food web that supports our animals. As a matter of fact, there's really just a few of them that are the powerhouses. About 5% of our native plants are supporting about 75% of the caterpillar food that drives food webs. 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives food webs, which means about 85% of our native plants aren't supporting that much in terms of food web support. So the question no longer is simply, are natives better than non-natives? On average, they certainly are. But I can build an all-native landscape that supports very little life because some of our native plants are really, really well protected. So the question really now is, do we want ecologically productive plants in our human-dominated landscapes? Or the alternative would be benign plants or ecologically destructive plants, those Asian ornamentals that escape so frequently and biologically pollute all the land around us. I get emails once or twice a year from somebody reminding me that, I said, don't you know ginkgos? Ginkgo biloba from Asia actually grew in North America 7 million years ago. That makes them native. That means we can plant them and everything will be great. Well, yes, I do know that ginkgos grew in North America 7 million years ago. We can argue about whether that makes them native, but I'm not going to bother because this is not our metric anymore. It's not whether they're native or not that matters. It's whether they're productive or not that matters. I don't care if ginkgo grew on the moon 7 million years ago. It produces 0 species of caterpillars. You can put it in your yard, but you're not going to support food webs. You can put your eucalyptus in your yard. You're going to support very, very little. What you ought to put in your yard, in many places in California, are those very powerful California oaks. 271 species of caterpillars in California. In the Mid-Atlantic region, we have 557 species, 900 species nationwide. There is no other plant genus that is nearly as productive as Quercus, as the oaks. And this is the power of keystone oaks in my yard. So remember, I've taken pictures of 1,027 moss species. Haven't gotten to the butterflies yet. So when I get that number will grow. But 1,027 moss species. Out of the 1,027 moss species, 902 have known host plants. So there's 125 that we don't know what they're eating. Out of the 902 species that we do know what they develop on, 265 use oaks. We have 59 genera. Actually, that's wrong. It's 67 genera of native woody plants on our property, and only one of which is the genus Quercus, the oaks. And we've got hundreds of genera of herbaceous plants. So oaks represent less than 2%, it's about 1.5% of our woody plant diversity, and way less than 1% of our total plant diversity. But they're supporting almost 30% of our moss species diversity, which in turn is supporting a great deal of our bird diversity. That's the power of a keystone plant in your landscape. If we took oaks out of the landscape, our diversity would be clobbered. So how do you find out what the keystone plants are for your where you live in California? I always talk about counties, but your California counties are so huge that luckily you have this feature called CalScape. In terms of finding the best plants for where you actually live, CalScape is the best tool in the entire country. I wish every state had a CalScape, but you guys are the only ones that have put it together. That's wonderful. For the rest of the country, this works pretty well. The Native Plant Finder from the National Wildlife Federation. You put in your zip code and the ranked list of woody and herbaceous plants that are best at supporting caterpillars for your county will pop up. But California's, I would certainly use CalScape, and they will tell you what the most productive plants are in your area. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants, attract lots of insects, particularly moths, to our yard, and then we're going to kill them at our security lights. And that, of course, is not the goal. There is a lot of research now, particularly coming out of Europe, that suggests light pollution at night is one of the major factors causing insect declines, at least in the temperate zones globally. So we don't know why insects go to lights. After wondering about it for 100 years, we still don't know, but we do know that it kills them in lots of different ways. So the moths that are flying around and around the lights will die from exhaustion. They collide with the light, they get incinerated, they get dehydrated. The bat comes and picks them off. There are a lot of nocturnal insects that are blinded by bright lights. And it messes up what they're supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be finding mates and laying eggs, but instead they're sitting on the side of the wall where your light is. This is actually good news to me. If this is one of the major causes of insect declines, it's also one of the easiest ones to turn around. Just turn your light out. What could be easier than that? But I know what you're going to say. I can't turn my light out because the bad man will come. Okay, put a motion sensor on your light so it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're gonna discover is that the bad man doesn't come very often. Now, if you don't want to do that, take the white light that is in your security light or any of your outdoor lights and switch it out for a yellow bulb. And a yellow LED bulb is the best because yellow wavelengths attract far fewer insects than do white wavelengths. Mercury vapor lights, those big, powerful security lights, those are the worst by far. If we were to switch to yellow LED lights across the country, we could save billions of insects almost instantly and a ton of energy. Seems like a no-brainer. The fourth thing we have to do is to landscape in a way that allows our caterpillars to complete their development. What do I mean by that? Well, I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where 511 species of caterpillars develop on oaks. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, completes its development on the tree itself. The caterpillars eat the leaves, they then spin a cocoon and hang from a branch, then the adult emerges and they do it all again. Everything happens on the tree. And I wish everything did that, but most don't. 94%, 480 species drop from the tree after they finish growing, and they wiggle their way underneath the ground and pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter under the tree. But that's the problem. We don't have any leaf litter under our tree, and we mow everything and compact the soil to the point where it's too hard for the caterpillars to wiggle underground to pupate. So this becomes an ecological trap. The moths come in, lay their eggs on these trees, the caterpillars develop, drop down, and then die. And the next generation is smaller, and the next generation after that is probably gone altogether. I am convinced that this is another major cause of insect decline because of the way we landscape. And of course, the cement landscape is even less of a viable option for caterpillars. I'm not trying to discourage trees in cities. I'm trying to discourage the profligate use of cement as a default landscape. We know this is a bad idea. It's just laziness, and it destroys our watersheds as well. This is what most people do. They have a tree in the middle of a big yard. big lawn. Nobody studied what the survivorship of caterpillars is in a situation like this, but I guarantee it is much better in a well-planted situation like this, where you have a tree, then you have a layered landscape with the plants that are appropriate for your biome. So where we live, maybe a dogwood here, a native azalea, some ferns, ground cover. The caterpillar drops down into a safe site. The ground is very loose because nobody's compacting the soil. It can easily get below ground. Or it can easily spin its cocoon in the leaf litter under here. It's not going to be mowed, not going to be trampled on. It's a safe site, and survivorship will be much higher. This is where we do our spring ephemeral gardening. And this is the way you can shrink the lawn if you happen to have any. You put your beds next to your trees and create more safe sites. If you have a big bed around all of your trees, the lawn area would be much smaller. And this is where you can use ground covers, like yerba buena, good ground cover for California. Again, safe sites for the caterpillars dropping down. Another PhD student, Desiree Narango, she's gone at this point, but her research on chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. Tells us that there's actually room for compromise in our plant choice. And this is good news. She studied population dynamics of chickadees in landscapes, typical suburban yards, that were dominated by native plants versus yards dominated by the Asian ornamentals that everybody uses. And the first thing she found is when those yards are dominated by Asian ornamentals, they produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, the amount of chickadee food was reduced by 75%. Those landscapes were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. So even though there's nest boxes up in each landscape, the birds would come along and look and say, there's not enough food here to rear our young. We're not even going to try. If they did try, those nests contained 1.5 fewer eggs, but they were 29% less likely to survive. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to reach maturity. So you might say, well, those aren't huge differences, but when you put all that together into a population growth model, this is what you get as a function of the percentage of woody non-native plant biomass in your yard, from no non-natives to 100%. This dotted line is replacement rate. This is the rate at which the population has to make babies to replace the adults that die every year. If you're reproducing at that rate, then it's a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking. If you reproduce at this rate, where you make more babies than adults die, you have a growing population. But if you make fewer babies than adults die, you have a shrinking, unsustainable population. Well, right here is where those lines overlap. So what that means is that when you exceed 30% of the woody plant biomass in your yard being non-native, when you get over into this area, you're unable to sustain breeding bird populations in your yard. And we have measured the amount of non-native plants in yards near where I live in Southeast Pennsylvania and Northeast Maryland and Delaware. 82% non-native plants. It's way down here in the unsustainable part. And I know that your California suburban yards are pretty high in non-native plants as well. But here's the exciting part. First of all, this is the first time that this has been measured for any bird anywhere. So people who doubt that their plant choice actually impact other creatures should check out this study. But this is the area of compromise I'm talking about. You can have up to 30% of your woody plant biomass in a non-invasive, non-native without destroying bird populations. And to me, that's good news, because we love our non-native plants. And if I said you're not allowed to have any of them, I'd have very few people listening to me. So the compromise is good. Can we get a pollinator garden into a traditional suburban yard like this without offending anybody? Sure we can. Just put a fence around it. That formalizes, that tells people that this is intentional. These are not a bunch of weeds. It's beautiful. You're servicing a lot of different pollinators, which is really important. You know, the language we use to encourage people to help pollinators, I disagree with it. We say, well, we need pollinators because they pollinate a third of our crops. It's a very anthropocentric view of why we need pollinators. And it's also incorrect. It's really around 1/7 of our crops pollinated by insects. And it suggests to people that if you don't live next to an agricultural field, you don't need any pollinators. That is not at all true. We need pollinators because they pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we would lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. Not an option. Where do we need those pollinators? Everywhere where we need plants, which is everywhere. And that includes our yards. How about this design here by Drew Latham? It gets a bigger, more sizable pollinator garden. Compare the amount of life that is here with the amount of life that is here. 0 versus quite a bit. And of course, your native asters. You got so many great plants that are great for pollinators. Don't forget those 60 species that use your sunflowers. Get a lot of those sunflowers in there. Another shot from Kathy Kramer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Of course they can. And more states, at least before the virus, were putting money towards this. Minnesota has a cost sharing program to encourage homeowners to convert some or all of their lawn to appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. They help you pay for it. There's an island in Florida that's paying the residents to allow burrowing owls, listed species, to nest in their front yard, to burrow in their front yard. If you have a burrowing owl, you actually get paid for it. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. That's why people, everybody would be fighting to have an endangered species in their yard because you get paid for it. Missouri had a bounty on calorie pear. This is one of the most invasive ornamentals that is still being sold today all over the place. But if you bring in or take a picture, I don't know how they did it, document that you've taken out a calorie pear, they give you a free tree replacement. And Fayetteville, Arkansas is doing the same thing now. And of course, hey, you have all your wonderful lawn replacement programs in California, up to $2 per square foot rebate for putting in appropriate xeric plantings instead of having that thirsty lawn that just doesn't belong there. I think we made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. The first being, we've assumed that nature's important. We like it, we want it around, but it's not essential. That's the misstep, which means when resources are tight, which is always, nature takes a back seat. I was in the Cincinnati Zoo just before the virus broke out, and there was this wall-sized poster that said, save wildlife for future generations. And this is our society's view of conservation. Our top conservation biologists talk this way. We need to save wildlife so our future generations can enjoy it. I mean, that was the language that Teddy Roosevelt used the whole time. We have to make national parks so that we all can enjoy these areas in the future. And that's true. All of that is true, except it suggests nature's there just for entertainment. It's much more urgent than that, folks. We need to save nature so that we have future generations. It's a little bit more urgent. Number 2, we've assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. I mentioned this in the beginning, but if we restrict our conservation efforts only to areas where we don't have a lot of humans, we're going to fail, because those areas are too small and too isolated to be able to sustain the species that we need. David Quammen has this excellent analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. That is not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are functioning like a Persian rug. And that, of course, is what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance, but I hate that language because it suggests there are places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance. Even our yards, even our corporate landscapes, even our infrastructure, all of it has ecological significance. So what we have to do is put the plants back. We need to glue our rug back together again, favoring those keystone plants that are supporting so much of the life around us. Where are we going to put them? We're going to put them in these white areas, these no man's lands, not just to build biological corridors for plants and animals to move back and forth, but we're going to make them rich enough so that they can live there. In other words, this is going to become good habitat, and we're going to share nature right where we humans are. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, few ecologists, few conservation biologists. We didn't see it as an inherent responsibility for every human being on the planet, but I don't know why. Every person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystem. So why wouldn't everybody bear the responsibility for good Earth stewardship? It's the only thing that makes sense. You don't have to save biodiversity for a living, but you really can save it where you live. And I like this approach because it empowers each one of us. You know, today it's so easy to feel powerless. The Earth's problems are so enormous that, it's easy to think one person cannot make a difference. But one person can make a difference. Go out and plant that oak tree. Shrink the lawn if you have any. Get rid of your invasive plants. Put in a pollinator garden. One person can do all of those things. And you are now a critical cog in the future wheel of conservation. And you can see the changes. You can see that it works very quickly. It also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't worry about the entire planet's problem. Just worry about your little piece of the planet. If you own property, that's obvious. You're going to work on your own property. If you don't own any property, though, you're not out of the picture. You can volunteer. You can help somebody who does own property. You can help a land conservancy or the nearby park to manage the properties that they own. All those places are short of funds, short of staff, so they love the volunteers. So as property owners or as volunteers, each one of us has the power to fix dead landscapes like this, and we certainly have the responsibility to do that. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate, and then ultimately our own fate. Now, I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Doug. That was fabulous. There's quite a few questions, and Judy Finnerty is going to take on relaying them to you. So, Judy, are you there?
We'll do our best. I know there's been quite a few little debates going on here about some of our favorite topics, milkweed and so forth. And, I know you've come out to California a number of times, and we're a little bit different here in a lot of ways, but
you're a lot different.
Thank you for your talk. It's lovely to see it again and more of it. So first question we had was, do you think that separating nature and human is destructive? My experience is that we are a part of nature.
Well, we are part of nature, but somehow we haven't internalized that. Forever we have decided that it is far better to live apart from nature. And, I'm pretty sure where that came from. In the old days, nature was a rough place. It was a dangerous place. There were a lot of predators that ate us. The weather ruined our crops and starved us. We fought against nature just to survive. And we did that for many, many, many thousands of years. So it's in our genes to be suspicious of the natural world that's going to keep us from reproducing. So we want to tame it. We want it to be perfectly neat and controlled, show nature who's boss. And that has led to this idea that we're not part of nature. But as I said earlier, we're products of nature. We were developed from it. We're totally dependent on it. And this adversarial relationship with nature has been extremely harmful to us. We've got to turn that mindset around.
Thank you. I agree. Someone also mentioned that Lady Bird Johnson, I don't know at what point in the talk this came up, but she also promoted native wildflowers for roadsides. And of course, there's the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center is still growing strong in Texas.
Yes, indeed.
So also, someone wanted to know if you knew anything about the American Prairie Reserve that's being set up in eastern Montana for 303.5 million acres of public-private partnership to reintroduce native herbivores and so forth. I don't know if you know
Is that
about
part of the Teddy Roosevelt National Park, or is this a new effort? Because maybe I don't know about it.
I think it's a new public-private partnership, but they want to restore it to Lewis and Clark conditions.
Did Ted Turner have anything to do with that, or?
I don't know. I'll see if I can get more
information. Okay, yeah, no, I haven't heard about that. Sounds exciting.
Yeah. So we have a lot of questions about milkweed. Do birds eat milkweed because they are toxic from eating the milkweed, the caterpillars?
Do they eat monarchs, you mean?
Monarchs, yeah.
Yeah, no, they don't. Yeah, monarch larvae taste terrible. There are great pictures of Lincoln Brower with blue jays feeding him a monarch caterpillar, and then the blue jay throws up. They learn very quickly. So the things that eat milkweed are often aposematic, meaning they're warning with their coloration that they taste bad. Milkweeds are essential to preserve the monarch. We want the monarch, but the reason we like the monarch is because it's a beautiful butterfly. It's not because it's a vital part of the food web. But that's just one species, and it does represent host plant specialization, which is, that's the rule out there. So in that sense, it's very, very helpful. But a lot of people say we have to save monarch because it's a great pollinator. No, it's not. It's a terrible pollinator. It goes and it sips nectar, but it doesn't transfer much pollen. But I mean, I'm not trying to put down save the monarch efforts. We definitely need to do that. And you folks in California need to do it, because what do you have, 1% left? I mean, it's a terrible situation now. And the way to do that is to put the milkweeds back. But it's not because you're going to help the birds in that particular case. But the generality is you will make a lot of palatable insects that will help the birds.
There is a lot of popularity for the monarch protection efforts. So someone asked how they can combat the trend by monarch hobbyists of bringing every egg and caterpillar inside to keep it safe from being part of the food chain that it's meant to be part of.
Yeah, that's controversial. But I certainly understand the reasoning. So when monarchs lay eggs on plants, 90% of them are killed by ants before they even hatch. So that's a 90% loss right there. If you find the eggs and you bring them inside and you're a good steward of those eggs and you rear them through, then you've got more monarchs. People are looking at it. Do hand-reared monarchs lose their ability to migrate? All these different questions. Are you actually introducing disease organisms that might spread? I think the big value of raising monarchs is in its educational value. You really can hook kids and a lot of other people by closely observing. That's your personal interaction that I'm talking about. And if it's, I guess there probably are downsides, but I think the upsides outweigh it. There's not enough people raising monarchs to make a big difference in terms of hurting the population. I don't think it's going to save the population. The best way to help monarchs is to plant a lot of milkweeds and the forage that they need as adults.
A few comments and questions have also come up about tropical milkweeds, which we see a lot we see a lot of Asclepias curvassica and Asclepias tuberosa, the eastern butterfly weed, planted in California, but there's Xerces Society and others recommend cutting those back, but others recommend not planting them at all and planting our locally native species.
There's no doubt that the local species are better. They're better adapted for your areas. But there's also no doubt that monarchs love Asclepias curassavica. It's that is the milkweed species that's down in Mexico when they get down there. The problem, of course, is the disease that's associated with many milkweeds in areas where the winter does not kill them, does not cause dieback. It's a protozoan. I can't never pronounce it. We just call it OE. But the spores get on the monarch's body. They eat them, and then their wings are deformed. And there are places, particularly in the Gulf Coast, where monarchs that visit Asclepias curassavica, 90% of them get OE. So it's another downside there. So if what monarchs like are soft tissues of milkweeds. They'll eat any of the milkweeds, but curassavica is soft all the time. Many of our native milkweeds over time get pretty tough. So that's why they seem to prefer it. But if you do cut it back periodically, right down to the ground, it does limit the number of spores on there. So I certainly would recommend doing that. But you can't go wrong with going with the many species of milkweeds that are native to your particular area.
Great, thank you. And speaking of moths, butterflies and moths, which species of primrose in California, I think evening primrose, attracts the sphinx moth you mentioned? And I would recommend Calscape as a way to find that out, actually. Or
yeah, I don't think it's just one species. I think it'll use any of the Enothera that you have.
Mm-hmm. Great. We also had a comment from one of our board members that as a co-owner of a 40-acre private reserve that's undisturbed, sell it to a land trust is not a catch-all solution, even in a region with many land trusts. Looking forward to talking with others about solutions for the future of these properties. So many species of birds and mammals on that site. So maintaining private property well, I think. So even no
through,
matter
through
how
the
small
generations, though, you gotta, you know, once the old folks die, what do the kids do with it? That's the problem. So
yeah. And I wanted to say myself, I'm reading through these comments in order of what they responded to your talk, that the Highline Trail is one of my favorites.
really, you've been there? Yeah.
Oh, many times. It's a native New Yorker, so also
Okay.
terrific to see it transformed. And I think it's also been the inspiration for many other urban linear trails and native plants. So they do a good job there. There was a question about which plants do we need for California foothills for caterpillars, and I think several people have recommended Calscape.
Calscape is the way to go. I would go there, you know.
Yeah. A lot of lawns still in California, and we have a lot of smaller lots in our urban spaces.
Right.
But let's see. I'm having trouble encouraging my friends to transition to natives. They want color all the time. What is a short but convincing thing to say without sounding obnoxious?
You know, I've been searching for that short thing for 15 years. Hooks work. So a lot of people that want color all the time also like birds, or they like butterflies. So the object is to get them to realize that plants are more than decorations. They are decorations, but they have critical ecosystem functions. And because we are now everywhere, we can't exempt our properties from performing those functions. So your friends have a responsibility, if they're going to own part of the earth. You know, the biosphere of the earth, that thin little layer around the earth, contains all the life that we know of in the universe. And it's certainly all the life we're ever going to interact with. If you're going to own part of it, you've got a responsibility of stewarding all the life in the universe. So you can't say, I'm just going to make it a pretty palette with color. You know, you've got to take care of it. That's the mindset, the obligation of Earth stewardship that we don't teach. And that's the difference between a lot of indigenous societies and our own. We teach that, you know, we have rights. Indigenous people say you got obligations to stewardship, and you're not born with those mindsets. You're taught them, and so the neighbors that are saying I just want color, they're just not realizing the impact of that statement, what that really means. How do you tell them that without them hitting you? I don't know.
It's hard when you go to the store and that's what they have, you know.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. But just start with the idea that plants do things, and they've got to do things. The 4 things every single property needs to do is maintain a food web. So you've got to have plants that are going to pass on their energy. You've got to support the pollinators. You've got to manage the watershed, and you know, what's the 4th thing? Oh, you got to sequester carbon. So if you have plants, you're going to sequester carbon, but the more plants you have, the better off you're going to be. And that's what every square inch of terrestrial earth has to do, including the pretty property. So it doesn't mean it has to be ugly, but you got to accomplish those things too. That's their responsibility as property owners.
We had a question from the East Bay about property owners being encouraged to clean up leaves under trees in the fall because of fire danger.
Oh, yeah.
What is the timing for the caterpillars pupating in the leaves?
Yeah. Yeah, you have to deal with fire, and we don't in the East, and it's a huge issue, that's for sure. I will point out that the biggest fire danger in California seems to be coming from the wood structures that we build as opposed to the plants. But, you know, we brought in invasive grasses like cheatgrass that are highly flammable. The fire starts there, then runs into areas that just explode. And so, you know, all the fire issues.
Mm-hmm. So the
yeah, I you know, but bare ground is no good either. So I don't know.
I think some bare ground is good for some bees, though. Some kind of bees.
A little bit of bare ground, but you know, the soil ecosystem is, there are more species underground than there are on top of the ground, and they're always susceptible to drought, to dryness. Mm-hmm. And with the terrible droughts that you're having now, you want to maintain as much soil moisture as possible. And that also will be good for fire control. You don't want things to dry up like crazy. So vegetation even if it's, living vegetation, is going to keep the moisture in better than the dead, dry things. But I am not an expert in fire management, and I don't want to start spouting off here because it's a serious issue. I get that part.
Yeah. I think it was more about the caterpillars. We don't always think about them.
A trade-off, yeah.
Yeah. So we had a question from our YouTube. What are the keystone species for the Bay Area besides oaks? A lot of times people have difficulty being able to plant oaks in small yards because of their size, or the cities discourage them from park strip. First
of all, there are a lot of smaller oaks, and a lot of your California oaks are quite small. So they're not all giants. Cyanothis is a very powerful plant, and there's a number of species in California that whose common names I don't know, but they're really important. Those sunflowers that I mentioned are definitely keystones in terms of pollinators. Cowscape. Look at Cowscape and look at the ones with the biggest numbers. Those are the keystone, because it changes as you go up in elevation, and if you're on the left side of the mountain or the right side of the mountain.
Actually leads into our next question. What importance do you place on planting native plants which are found in a specific local area, or do you feel like it's okay to plant plants that are found in relatively local areas? We actually have a lot of plants in horticulture that are Channel Island species, but they do great in gardens all over. So what are your thoughts about local natives?
Well, I'm trying to reestablish food webs, and food webs are much less sensitive to plant placement than the plants themselves are. So the provenance of the plant often determines whether it can grow successfully in your valley or at your altitude or on your side of the mountain. The insects that use those plants are pretty good at finding them. So if you have a plant that you put in the wrong place and it dies, it's not going to help the insects very much. So it depends on what, if you're moving it from one bioregion to another, that could be a problem for the plant. But for example, in the east here, pipevine grows along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, but it's become an ornamental. People plant it. Well, the pipevine swallowtail, the specialist that uses it, has followed it wherever people plant it. You've got pipevine swallowtails now in Virginia Beach, right next to the ocean. So is that a bad thing? You've kept that interaction together. It's not exactly, it's bigger. It's in a bigger area than it was before. I don't know. I don't think that's bad, but some people do. So
I think we've actually had a similar thing going on with our local swallowtails and pipevines. Actually, people planting it out of range, but still works. Let's see. Many highway departments and the Federal Department of Transportation are promoting a pollinator and monarch corridor around the interstate. I'm not sure that's in California, but maybe. Does that make sense, growing such plants in a heavily used roadway?
We actually did a study on insect mortality along roads, and it happens for sure. The insects fly out in the road and they get smashed. So the question is, can you create a habitat that creates more insects than are killed by its proximity to the road? One thing we found from our study is that the type of vegetation that is on the roadside makes a big deal. It's a big factor. Planting medians is probably not the way to go, because the insects have to cross the road to get to the median, and they will try. So there's a lot of slaughter of bees and butterflies when you have medians planted with things that attract them. But there's more research that needs to be done. One of the things that appeared to be happening, but we didn't study it specifically, was that if there's a barrier like a guardrail, a lot of the bees and things would hit that and just turn around. So that actually prevented a lot of the mortality. And it depended on how close the planting was to the roadway itself. If it was maybe 10 feet back, there was a lot less mortality. But certainly the traffic volume is going to be an issue. I would recommend doing this extensively on less traveled roads. I mean, there are people in the Midwest, when I say we got to be careful about planting, they say, we get one car an hour here. And believe me, that's not causing a lot of mortality. Yet the entire side of the road is grass. So in situations like that, definitely you want to get them planted. But along a major highway where you have, 100 cars a minute or 100 cars every 30 seconds, that's a rough situation. So that might be a good place to not do it.
Oh, that's great. If you had time for a few more questions, we're
Sure. Yeah.
getting a very lively chat in here. So there were questions about oaks. Other folks were recommending scrub oaks, also things like redbud and holly leaf cherry, which is our local.
Yeah, holly leaf cherry is another one of those very high keystone species. So.
And leafcutter bees were mentioned in a garden, but they also will enjoy western redbud too.
Yes.
Leafcutter bees.
Yes.
So.
Mm-hmm.
Any suggestions on how to best handle subterranean termites in an ecologically friendly way? Not one I could. I don't know. Do you know anything about termites?
Well, they have, they used to just put chlordane around the base of your house, which lasted for decades. And I'll give you an example from when I went to graduate school at the University of Maryland. There was a lab where they studied, not a lab, it was an office, but they had studied chlordane in there something like 20 years earlier. Then they stopped doing that, and then it was somebody's office, and they tried to rear insects in there. The insects still died. So the guy sitting in this office was exposed to that level of chlorine after 20 years. Very powerful stuff. They don't do that anymore. It's outlawed. But what they do is sink termite baits into the soil that contain the pesticide that the termites then eat and take back to the colony and die. It's a much more targeted approach. So it's much more ecologically friendly. You do have to deal with your termites. I mean, they're a real issue. But the termite bait thing is pretty good. So first of all, they find out whether you've got termites at all and where they are specifically. So you don't have to put a lot of material down just because you're guessing where they are. So I cannot think of a better way to do that. But you can't just ignore the termites. So
yeah. We had some people responding that the Hooker's evening primrose supports the Pacific green sphinx moth.
Okay, there you go.
We're just answering each other's questions here like crazy in the chat. So we also had a request from one of our garden tour community members to let people know that thanks to your research and thanks to your work, we've switched from 50 to 70% natives in gardens. That they're requiring for our garden tour. So we're looking for
to
more,
be able to give the tour. It has to be
get on the tour. Yeah, we take 50 or 60 gardens every year on the Going Native Garden Tour in our two counties. So now we're asking for people to be at 70% because of your research. Good. So thank you for that. Could you please repeat the 4 things for every homeowner, if you don't mind?
Well, what every land ought to be doing, every piece of land, is to have the plants that support some type of food web. And the more complex the food web, the more animals it supports, the better. Which means you've got to have palatable plants. You have to support your bees. So very often the plants that support a food web, like oaks, are not the ones that are going to support your pollinators. Oaks are wind pollinated. So those that continuous bloom, I guess in California, it's got to be continuous all year round. Where we are, it's from April to October that needs to be in bloom to support the native bees. We got 4,000 species of native bees. They need a lot of care. Yeah. We need to sequester carbon everywhere because 30% of the carbon that's in the atmosphere comes from removing plants on our planet. So we like to live in this very broad, open, savanna-like landscape where there's very few plants. That carbon's up in the air. We can suck a lot of it out just by planting plants, including the meadow prairie type plants. They have very deep root systems and they pump a lot of carbon into the soil. So it's not just trees that do that. And then manage watersheds. So a lot of these things are doing the same thing. Your oak is a perfect plant to manage watersheds because its root system is so large, but so are all those prairie plants. That picture behind you there, Judy, that's managing a watershed for sure. So.
It's in a state reserve, yeah. So, but this area was one of the areas that burned in our local area this last year. So we'll see what next year looks like.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
But I might point out that out of those 4 things, lawn doesn't do any of them.
No.
So there's the trade-off.
Yeah. And we had a question about, speaking of lawns and manicured landscapes, a couple of questions about leaf blowers and all the damage they do to removing leaves and things. There are a lot of them in California. Do you have some leaf blowers? Can we talk people out of them?
Good luck. I mean, it's a city ordinance thing. It is preferable. I mean, in the East here, a lot of people will mow the leaves and mulch them. they'll grind them up. But that, of course, the Luna moth that's in a cocoon and the leaf litter gets ground up too. A leaf blower at least will just blow it to the side rather than grinding it up. So that's a plus. But the noise pollution.
Yeah, it's an issue for sure. I'm just running through things. We're having some debates here, so I'm not sure. I want to give you some unique questions. So someone mentioned that the native people set fires under the oaks to control the number of insects, and there was a lot more biodiversity at that time. We also, before invasive species.
I don't think it was to control the insects. It was to keep the, it kept the fuel down. Mm-hmm. It created new growth and promoted, the maintenance of game. Mm-hmm. So fire management by Native Americans happened all over the country, and because they did it religiously all the time, you didn't get the buildup of the fuel, and you didn't have the giant crown fires that we have now. So, but I don't think it was to control the insects.
We got a couple people. If you're raising your hand, please put your question into the Q&A or into the chat. We're not going to call on anyone raising hands. So I just want to mention that. We're going to also, this talk will be recorded. It is being recorded. And the chat that's going on the YouTube is going to be recorded on that recording as well. So there's some good suggestions in there by our neighboring chapter. For plants, I want to ask my co-hosts if there's anything else that we should ask at this time, because I think we're getting up to about 6:30 our time. That must be late their place. I may ask one more question. Someone said it's about getting more acorns. You mentioned the importance of woody plant biomass. What about the importance of non-woody plant biomass?
Right. It just wasn't part of the study. I'm sure that's important. It'll be particularly important. So you could ask the same question. What amount of native plant biomass do you need to maintain a certain number of species of bees? None of that's been done. So what we're trying to do, we don't want to overinterpret the data of this particular study on chickadees, but it's the only study that's been done like that. And everybody says, okay, I'm going for 30%. That's what happened in that study. It really needs to be repeated a number of times. It was a big NSF grant that a 4-year grant, and it's over and it's tough to get refunded, but it needs to be done in different areas so that we can get patterns rather than saying this is one study and that's what everybody should do. But it's the best we have right now.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all your patience answering all these questions.
You're welcome.
I'm sure you've heard a lot of them before. So,
well, you Californians ask different questions there.
And I just wanted to mention that we do have in our YouTube channel, our older YouTube channel, which you can find, telling everybody, we do have a lot of gardening with natives recorded talks on year-round color from native plants. So there is a way to plant your garden with year-round color.
Good.
So, yeah. So thank you. Vivian, thank you very much for coming out again. Vivian, did you have more you wanted to say?
Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, thank you again, Doug. It's always a thrill to hear you. It's, I think all of us are inspired always when we hear you. And
great.
I know for me, it also helps with talking about this to other people. You have such a wonderful way of.
Yeah, you can just blame it all on me, and then
Well, it's wonderful to have it recorded too. I always am encouraging my friends and sometimes forcing them to watch your talks. And it's like I said earlier, it's transformative. I really do feel it is.
Great.
So, and thank you for being up late to talk with us. I know.
Okay. Well, I think I'll go to bed now then.
Okay.
All right. Take care.
All right. Thanks. And for all of the CNPS folks, I just wanted to give you a quick update. So I'm going to share my screen here. We will be ending the meeting in just a moment, but I wanted to let you know that we do have some fun things coming up. The photography group has decided that they want to meet again in December. So please, if you're interested, don't listen to what we wrote in the Blazing Star, because we are actually having a December meeting for the photography group. We have a really great talk scheduled in December. It's going to be an update on what's going on at Edward Park. They will also be, or Stuart will also be talking about this hydromechanical pulverization, which is this very interesting technique that they've been working on to help with restoration. So I'm personally very excited about it, and I think everybody else should be too. So that will happen on December 16th. And we've also been getting a lot of questions about when the nursery store is going to reopen. And so I just thought I'd throw it up here. We're expecting that to happen next week. We don't quite have all the details worked out yet, but we're getting pretty close to reopening the online store. So just stay tuned and you'll be able to get your plants soon now that it's rain is hopefully in our futures. It's planting time. And oh, yes, and just my own personal public service announcement, wildflower seeds, great time to go and throw some out there in your gardens now. Don't forget. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. It was great to get together. Hopefully next year we'll be able to do it in person. But meanwhile, hey, we're here online and we're going to keep on doing this. So thanks a lot, everybody.
On behalf of the board, Vivian, and all of everyone in our committees and all of the chapter members, I just want to say thank you for keeping us together this year, doing all the Zoom, doing the nursery, doing the plant sales. We just really appreciate you so much, and we could not have done it without you.
I want to add my voice to that. Thank you, Vivian. I'm clapping.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's been a lot of fun. A lot of challenges this year, but this group is amazing. And we've got lots of volunteer opportunities coming up. So stay tuned and join us. All right. Well, I'm going to end the meeting. So thanks, everybody. Good night.